Hello, ladies. I am preparing to go to a conference, a women's empowerment and entrepreneurship conference in Toronto, Canada. And I am so excited to get out of the United States for a little bit and to meet the wonderful women of our neighboring country in Canada. But let's pick up from the story that we left off. So you're kind of seeing my Washington, D.C. experiences in school, college, how I began plus size modeling, also working in television news. So where I left off was on Capitol Hill, the U.S. House and Senate radio, television, press galleries. One thing I forgot to mention, kind of during the time I was going through these interview processes, I did have a quick stint at Voice of America, which for a lot of people who are out of the country are familiar with, because it was originally like the radio station that countries got news about the United States. Again, when I was there, the equipment was a little bit older, and as I explained before, I was not used to physically cutting tape. So the equipment that they had at Voice of America, I guess by it being government, was a rounded kind of taped format. They also had something called WorldNet, which was supposed to be the television complement to Voice of America. But I had a quick little stint there. The people there were amazing, but I didn't stay very long. I also noted that in order to really excel in that atmosphere, you really needed to know a language or two. So I was kind of not ready to work in news in that kind of capacity. So anyway, back to the story. So as you know, I went to the big Radio Television Correspondents Association dinner, and I explained how important that was, because you're hosting all the correspondents on Capitol Hill, all of the congressional leaders, and you are hosting the President of the United States of America. There's also these suites, as I explained, and each television network has a suite. So it could be CBS, it could be NBC, and I took the time to go to NBC's suite, and I met a producer who was doing MSNBC in Washington, D.C. And I explained that I had gotten this letter that was kind of oddly written, kind of like, if you're in a neighborhood, stop by. And I'm like, should I make the trip? It really wasn't very forthcoming as to, yes, we would like to interview you. Please call this number at this time, what I was accustomed to. And the producer explained to me that that letter was their way of saying that they did want to interview you, but that they weren't going to pay for your trip. I was thinking why they just couldn't type that out, but that's what was explained to me. So I did end up making the phone call, and I did get called in to interview. Now note, I think I had been holding on to this letter for about a month, maybe even a little bit longer. So when they first sent that letter out, MSNBC was in Fort Lee, New Jersey. It was sharing a space, from what I understand, with CNBC. And from what I understand, my experiences would have probably been very different if I were in that smaller space starting out than when I arrived at MSNBC during their expansion period. So I get ready to go for the interview. And in Washington, as many Washingtonians know at that time, the standard professional suit is navy blue. Whereas in New York, your standard professional suit was black at the time. So I found the best navy blue suit that I could possibly find for my interview. And then it was the challenge of driving to Secaucus, New Jersey for the interview. So when I got there, as many women do, we like to freshen up and go to the ladies' room. So when I went to the ladies' room, there was a young woman who was crying her eyeballs out. And there was another lady there, a little bit older, who was consoling her. And I remember kind of tiptoeing and trying to listen. And I heard her say, and the producers did this, and the producers did that, and I tried to talk to so-and-so. And I was kind of overhearing the story, and I can't remember the specific details, but I remember thinking to myself, I have been preparing myself for this kind of an opportunity since I was 12 years old, and nothing is going to stop me from excelling and achieving and doing my very best. And I started to listen to the story, and I started to think to myself, this is chick stuff. Like, this is girly chick stuff, and I don't want feminists contacting me saying, why are you saying girly chick stuff? You know what I mean, when women become a little bit petty about things. So the story, in not its context, seemed like something that probably was a little bit petty from my perspective of just walking into the ladies' room. So I proceeded to go to my interview, which my first interview was in the human resource department. And they were extremely impressed because, like I said, for young ladies, I started interning literally actually in high school, which is more available now, but back then was very rare. I actually started my first internship, I said, was George Michael Sports Machine, but I actually did a little stint at KYW 1060 News Radio in Philadelphia. It was a program. So I'm in the MSNBC Human Resource Department being interviewed. And they looked at my resume and they were amazed. It was like, how old are you again? Because I had all this experience at major networks in Washington, D.C., which for back in the day, you had this ADI, the ratings, the different cities, and Washington was a major news area to come from. So the fact that I had concrete experience in NBC and sports and Fox, and then oddly enough, they were a new company. I believe I was there their first year. And it was this new concept of merging news and technology. And I had worked with the Interactive Television Association, or Association for Interactive Media. And that was a unique background item to have, as well as having this specialized training from Capitol Hill. So they were very, very impressed with the resume, and they kind of asked, do you want to go on the producer track, or would you prefer to go on the reporter track? Is kind of how they explained it. And of course, I was more interested in the reporter track. Now, looking back, I'm thinking there were different ways that they sliced up positions, and considering the experience and things that I did have, I probably really should have started off as a writer in the reporter slash producer track. But because I'm coming from a generation of baby boomers for parents, you were given this concept that you really need to start here and work your way up. And that was always drilled in my head to, start in a certain location and work your way up, which is very different than the young ladies that I spoke to at the George Washington University sorority, where they want their positions now. So, but back then you really were kind of doing career tracking, career pathing. So I started off, a little bit lower than probably my accolades presented themselves, partially because that's what I accepted, and partially because that's what they preferred, I guess, to put me at. But looking back, really probably should have started as probably a writer. So why is it important where you start, especially now? I believe because if you have a certain amount of experiences, starting beneath your experiences, so to speak, doesn't always serve you well, and doesn't necessarily give you the respect of the environment that you're in. But, again, this was what I think traditionally a lot of my generation did. So I went back to Washington and I waited and I waited. And then I called the producer in Washington, and I told him about my experience, and I told him I was kind of waiting. And he said, okay. He said, let me tell you what I think, some pointers on what you should do to show that you're really interested in the job. And I won't go into that now, but there was a very specific way to show that you were interested in working at the company. And this is what, would expedite your process in getting hired. Eventually, they called me back and they said, we're going to pay for your trip. And that meant I got a train ride, and they said they'll have the limo come pick me up. So at first I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I'll probably take the train to New Jersey, North Jersey, and then the limo will come pick me up. But they said, no, you're going to travel into New York, and then we'll have the limo come pick you up, because NBC, as opposed to MSNBC, is in New York, was in New York City. So the limo came and picked me up. And I'm excited to get my second interview. And I went to the ladies' room to freshen up. When I walked into the ladies' room, there was another young lady crying. And there were two women in there consoling her. One a little bit more angry, and the other one a little bit more consoling. And again, I'm tiptoeing. I'm starting to think, maybe I'm getting hired for one of their positions. So I was listening to the story, and again, I don't really remember all the details of the story, but I remember thinking in my mind again, I have been preparing for this since I was 12 years old. And what I mean by preparing, not just academically, but in some sacrifices and some things, I had really prepared myself to be in a news environment. So I left and I went to my second interview. And again, they were very impressed with my background. And he kind of went over what HR went over. And, went over, are you doing the producer track or are you doing the reporter track? And took me for a tour of the facility and met with, I think, one or two people. But newsroom is usually pretty chaotic, so I didn't really have time to talk to too many people. And then I went back home, and they said, we'll tell you what our decision is. So I went back, and I think it was another month before I got the call that said, you got the job. And now I had the very tough decision to leave Washington, D.C. I never really wanted to leave D.C. And as because it was, like I said, an election year, the private and public sectors kind of freeze up. So it was difficult to find a job in the city, particularly, you're fortunate as a broadcast major, which actually wasn't my major, to get a broadcasting job. So I was fortunate to even be being interviewed for journalistic jobs and to be interviewed at that level. So I went back, and when they told me that I got the job, I had, I think, just moved into an apartment overlooking Washington in Arlington, across from the Pentagon. And I was so sad because it was, it's your first apartment. As a young woman, you have your first apartment. I had my own car and I had my own job. So I was feeling pretty empowered and accomplished. And I had to leave a city that I had been in for 5 years. So I want to take a moment to talk about salaries, because it was 20 years ago. Over 20 years. Was it 20 years ago? Because I think it's important to note about the profession for young women who are getting involved, and also kind of your decision-making process. Because I come from a generation where we were made a lot of promises of what our future was supposed to be, that it was supposed to be a lot better than our parents' generation. And now I think young ladies are in a more uncertain time, which makes their decisions a little bit different. But the salary that I was offered, supposedly, this is what I was told, because of my experience, I was the highest paid person in that position. But compared to my friends that I went to college with, who had just started their careers, I was $20,000 less than the average salary of most of my friends, and probably $40,000 less than my friends who were in specialized, positions like engineering or law or something like that. So I bring that up because we're looking at pay equity and equal pay for women. And probably particularly those women who started in television during my generation, and maybe even prior, really started off in a percentage less than the percentage that they're quoting you that women get paid now. I think it's 70 cents to the 100% dollar. So you figure if the salaries were $20,000 to $40,000 less, we were probably making what, 30%. You could do the numbers there, but significantly less than what my college friends were making at their jobs. And that is another sacrifice that you make when you get involved in television news. So I really liked my apartment in Washington, D.C. It was across from the Pentagon, and it overlooked all of Washington. I could see the monument, the Capitol, Roslyn. I really suggest at some point in your life that you take a living space that is high up, because at the end of your workday, it really gives you perspective. And especially because I was blessed to work in these very high profiled places, it gave you that morning of it's time to conquer the world, but at night, how small you are in perspective to the world. So I really suggest if you get the opportunity to live high up, to try it. It does a lot for the working spirit. So I was off, and I had the arduous task, like many people, to get rid of the apartment you're in and find a new place to live and all that good stuff. And I had to take a temporary place because of how quickly things turned around. So I ended up staying a couple hours away, like an hour away from where I was working. So this is my new thing. I like to say, let me put this into perspective for you. MSNBC, which I'm not going to tell the entire story. You're going to have to look for the upcoming books. But I will talk a little bit about my thoughts in retrospect and kind of the industry as a whole. So I was at MSNBC when it had just began. I believe that was the first year. I believe that's when they moved from Fort Lee to Secaucus. And looking back, MS being Microsoft and NBC being the news station and the umbrella company being GE, I started to feel like they were a startup company. And because they were a startup company, certain things were structured differently, even though that's not what they explained to you. But now that many of us have been in these startup companies, I think it gives me a different kind of perspective in what I was actually walking into. The facility was brand new. It had the highest level of equipment. And it had a lot of young, at the time, the dot-com generation, of people who didn't necessarily have a lot of news experience. And being in Washington, you worked with people who have been veterans in the industry for 10, 20 some odd years. And I was walking into an environment where a lot of the production team, this was their first year. And then they had kind of like a satellite NBC team that was a little bit more advanced, but they were really focused on, I think, national NBC. So this is kind of the environment, which was very similar to Capitol Hill, because you kind of had the dot-com people and you had a sprinkle of another generation. So one of the memories that I have is I believe they called him the GM. If I recall, he was a member of Radio Television News Directors Foundation, probably. And I remember we had a power outage at MSNBC. And he came running down the steps. What are you doing? We are live. And the entire team that was there froze. And it was because The computers were down. The phones were down. And then on top of it, you had people who, unlike myself, didn't really have a lot of experience in local news or how to get information, because it was kind of a production house, so to speak. So the concept of who to call and pick up the phone and get the story and physically write it and give it to the anchor while we're live, a lot of people just froze. So this is a perfect example of when companies hire people, and now, I guess, or even then, that it's important to put people in the proper position, and also a lesson to us Generation Xers who took lesser positions, because I was probably one of the few people, and for some reason the NBC desk that day, because they would have had that kind of knowledge, was light. I think there was only one person on duty. Would have had the experience to know how to get the national news. So, for example, if we were in the middle of a story about Capitol Hill, obviously I would know exactly who to contact because that's where I came from. The other things of getting information, they were accustomed to pulling production from other cities to put together a news story, which was a different process. Which is why I say it's a national person and a local person are trained and have a different kind of background and information. And I think this is a perfect example of the good side and the bad side, because if you have that step-by-step training, then you know what to do in a crisis situation. But if you don't, we're live. So, another thing to put into perspective. I was there during the death of Princess Diana, which ran for 45 weeks. And this was the all news network format. So for local news people who have never been in a national or network news environment, you don't get all day to prepare for a story. You don't get all day to cut tape. You get 15 minutes, not even 15 minutes. So that show is done where tape was being cut the stories were being cut every 15 minutes. And you had to figure out new content for the same story every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. So needless to say, you're kind of like, it can become somewhat nauseating, particularly if it's a story like that. And then there are some journalists who are diehard, we keep analyzing, trying to find something new with the story that switches your ratings. Ratings was interesting too, because again, I was there during the time that I guess there was probably a ratings week. And again, the GM had to come downstairs. And they were looking at CNN. And I forget what the story was, but I remember we were falling behind. And I remember the producer saying, well, we're MSNBC. We're trying to do this new technological format. And I just remember the guy saying pretty much, forget the format. Not so nicely that way. And follow what CNN's doing. Now note, the people that were there when I was there and the people that are there now are two different people. But I do remember that moment of when probably MSNBC was no longer this brand new tech model, but a company that was trying to compete with another company. I'll have to look at the news roster, news notes that I have from that time period. But Uh, I did work with people such as Soledad O'Brien, who, if memory serves me correct, had just came over from something called Tech TV. And I was there during the time of Ed Gordon, who, from what I understand, was hired because he was the first reporter to be able to, or anchor to be able to interview O.J. Simpson. I was there while Brian Williams was there, and various other people that'll probably come to mind, either later in a tape or in the book. But it was a historical time to be part of a historical game-changing network that was kind of struggling to identify itself. It was also very chaotic because they were going through an expansion, and they had a lot of young people to give this kind of young face to news, but you still needed traditional, intelligent, noteworthy people to facilitate an all news network. I also have this odd memory compared to what I was used to in Washington. Was like at lunchtime, they always had the Jerry Springer show on. And I remember it was like always the production staff looking at Jerry Springer. That wasn't our like pastime television in Washington. So that was interesting to watch, because I would kind of be like, you do know this is tabloid television and we're supposed to be respectable news people? So, as I was explaining, the atmosphere was a little chaotic. I'm going to say because of the expansion. Looking back, these are just my opinions. And I remember, and as I'm explaining, you had to produce programming every 15 minutes. So there was like a sub-staff, which is what I was part of, that was there consistently for a certain amount of hours. And then maybe that production team, directive team in the control room would change every 15 minutes. And part of the issue was a lack of proper training and a lack of introduction to the staff. So people were missing what we used to call running scripts, because people didn't know who was who the new team that was going in, and if you had just started, that was something very difficult. So one of the things I did, which I noticed, was that usually when you get on a new job, there's an announcement. So, welcome so-and-so. They come from such and such. They have done the following. And I didn't see any of that in our communication. So I found something in the system where you could email or send a memo to the staff. So I decided to enter my information about my background and also add a photograph. And I figured this would be a great way for them to be able to identify me if they're looking for their scripts or whatever it is that they were looking for the show, and a way for them to be introduced to me. Well, let me just tell you, they loved me for that. So they always had you training someone. So remember, there was a new person coming aboard, and everyone was kind of whispering because the gentleman's mother worked either in one of the other companies or the company itself. Can't remember exactly. And, you know, it was a bit of nepotism going on. So they didn't feel like this person was qualified to even be there. Remember, I said they. I didn't say anything about me. I said them. So now the information was circulating around about my background. And I remember this person walking up to me and saying, "You went to GW?" I said, "Yeah." I'm thinking, "Oh, did they go to the GW too? We have something in common. Great, cool." And he says, "What kind of merit scholarship did you get? Because the only way people like you get into GW is on a scholarship." So I remember thinking that was very rude, amongst other things. But it was just fascinating that this person that everybody was talking about, who supposedly in their eyes didn't deserve the position, and I wasn't singing the same song that they were singing, that he approached me of all people, considering, you know, I had worked pretty hard all through school since I was 12 years old for this position, for this kind of a position. Internships, sleepless nights, and GW was no joke. I run into people now who say, "Oh yeah, I remember you at GW," and either they didn't graduate or they ended up having to stop and finish someplace else. So I started to feel really fortunate that I was able to complete my degree at the George Washington University in DC. And here was a person questioning that. So, MSNBC. There are so many more stories to tell, but you'll have to wait for the book for it. But it is interesting that I was there, and some things now are kind of reflective because we have the miniseries on OJ. We have the recent story about credibility in journalism with Brian Williams. And we're looking at a lot of stories from what is now Blacks in America, from the production team of Soledad O'Brien. It's a very, very interesting, reflective mirror. So, I am very excited to meet the wonderful ladies of Toronto, Canada. And I would like to take a moment to thank the wonderful women of Philadelphia and South Jersey who came out to see me at Macy's. I am the international brand ambassador for Sexy and Wealthy in Heels. Sexy means being confident, and wealthy means living a lifestyle and brand that you want to live.